There, in the shadow of an ancient oak tree, lay a German shepherd. His once majestic frame was now a shadow of its former self, ribs protruding through his matted fur, his eyes sunken and hollow. His body trembled as he dragged himself forward, inch by agonizing inch, his paws leaving faint trails in the damp earth. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if every step was a battle against an invisible force. But what truly shocked anyone who might have seen him was not his emaciated state, it was the look in his eyes, a look of sheer, unrelenting terror. The dog paused, his ears twitching as if he had heard something. His head snapped toward the darkness, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment he seemed to consider retreating, disappearing back into the shadows from which he had emerged. But then, with a desperate determination, he continued forward, his gaze fixed on a distant light, a faint glow emanating from a small house on the edge of the forest. Who was this dog? What had driven him to this state? And why did he seem so terrified of the very darkness that surrounded him? The answers lay hidden, buried beneath layers of pain and fear. But one thing was certain. This was no ordinary stray. This was a creature who had seen the worst of humanity, and yet, against all odds, had chosen to seek help. As the German shepherd finally reached the edge of the forest, he collapsed onto the cold ground, his body trembling with exhaustion. The TA. Light from the house was just a few feet away, but it might as well have been miles. He let out a soft whine, a sound that was equal parts plea and surrender. And then, as if summoning the last of his strength, he lifted his head and let out a single mournful howl, a sound that echoed through the night, carrying with it a story of pain, survival, and hope. The door of the house creaked open, and a figure stepped out, silhouetted against the warm light. The dog's eyes met theirs, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. What happened next would change both of their lives forever. The figure in the doorway was a woman in her late 30s, her face etched with concern as she scanned the darkness. She had heard the howl, a sound so haunting, so full of despair, that it had sent a shiver down her spine. She stepped out onto the porch, her breath visible in the cold night air, and peered into the shadows. At first, she saw nothing. The forest was a wall of blackness, impenetrable and foreboding. But then her eyes caught movement, a slight shift in the darkness, a flicker of something alive. She squinted, her heart pounding in her chest, and that's when she saw him. The German shepherd lay just a few feet from the edge of the forest, his body trembling, his eyes locked on hers. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She took a step forward, then hesitated. The dog's eyes were filled with fear, and his body language screamed caution. His ears were flattened against his head, his tail tucked tightly between his legs. He was a creature who had learned to expect the worst from humans, and it showed in every line of his emaciated frame. The woman crouched down, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice calm and reassuring. "I'm not going to hurt you." She extended a hand, palm up, and waited. The dog flinched, his body tensing as if expecting a blow. But when none came, he let out a soft whimper, his eyes never leaving hers. She noticed the details then, the scars that crisscrossed his body, the patches of fur that had been torn away, the way his ribs jutted out painfully. This was a dog who had been through hell, and it broke her heart to see him like this. But there was something else too, something that sent a chill down her spine. Around his neck was a collar, or what was left of one. It was torn and frayed, the metal tag hanging by a thread. She couldn't make out the name, but she could see that it had been scratched out as if someone had tried to erase his identity. The dog's eyes darted toward the forest, and for a moment she thought he might bolt. But then, with a trembling sigh, he lowered his head, his body sagging with exhaustion. He was too weak to run, too broken to fight, and yet there was a spark of something in his eyes, a faint glimmer of hope. The woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of jerky she had been saving for her own dog. She held it out, her hand steady, and waited. The dog's nose twitched, and for a moment he seemed to consider it. But then, with a sudden jerk, he pulled back, his body trembling even more violently. "It's okay," she repeated, her voice soft but firm. "You're safe now." She placed the jerky on the ground and slowly backed away, giving him space. The dog watched her with wary eyes, his body tense, ready to flee at the slightest provocation. As she retreated to the porch, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest seemed to close in around her, the shadows shifting and twisting in the moonlight. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the endless expanse of trees. She turned back to the dog, who was still lying in the same spot, his eyes fixed on her. "I'll be back," she promised, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going to leave you." But as she stepped inside and closed the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, waiting. The woman spent the rest of the night researching. She scoured the internet for any reports of missing or abused German shepherds in the area, but found nothing. It was as if the dog had appeared out of thin air, a ghost from the forest. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that there was something deeply unsettling about the whole situation. The next morning, she returned to the spot where she had found the dog, armed with a bowl of water and some food. He was still there, lying in the same spot, his body trembling in the cold morning air. But this time, when she approached, he didn't flinch. His eyes followed her every move, but there was a new expression in them, something that looked almost like trust. She placed the bowl of water in front of him and stepped back, giving him space. The dog hesitated for a moment, then slowly, painfully dragged himself forward. He lapped at the water with a desperation that broke her heart, his body shaking with the effort. As he drank, she took the opportunity to examine him more closely. The scars on his body were old, but there were fresh wounds too, cuts and bruises that looked like they had been inflicted recently. And then there was the collar. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against the frayed fabric. The dog tensed but didn't pull away. She carefully unhooked the collar and held it up to the light. The tag was barely legible, the name scratched out so thoroughly that it was impossible to make out. But there was something else, a series of numbers etched into the metal, almost as if someone had tried to erase them too. She frowned, her mind racing. What did it mean? Was it some kind of code? Or was it just a random series of numbers? She pocketed the collar and turned her attention back to the dog. He had finished the water and was now eyeing the food she had brought. She placed it on the ground and stepped back, watching as he devoured it with a ravenous hunger. As he ate, she noticed something else, a faint trail of drag marks leading from the forest to the spot where he now lay. Her heart sank as she realized what it meant. The dog hadn't walked here. He had been dragged, his body too weak to carry him any further. Someone had brought him here, dumped him like trash, and left him to die. The thought filled her with a cold, burning anger. Who could do something like this? And why? She knelt down beside the dog, her hand hovering just above his head. He flinched, but didn't pull away. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know who did this to you, but I promise I'm going to find out." The dog looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude, and for the first time he leaned into her touch, his body trembling with the effort. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to her. As she stood up, she noticed something else, a set of footprints in the mud leading away from the forest. They were fresh, the edges still sharp and defined. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized that someone had been here, watching them. And they hadn't been gone for long. She glanced back at the dog, who was now lying still, his eyes half closed. "We need to get you out of here," she said, her voice firm. "It's not safe." But as she reached down to pick him up, she heard a sound, a faint rustling in the trees. Her head snapped up, her heart pounding in her chest. The forest was silent, but she could feel it, the presence of someone, or something, watching them. She hesitated for a moment, then made a decision. She couldn't leave the dog here, not with whoever or whatever was out there. She bent down and carefully lifted him into her arms, his body trembling with fear. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. I've got you." As she carried him back to the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The forest seemed to close in around her, the shadows shifting and twisting in the morning light. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest, and didn't stop until she was safely inside, the door locked behind her. But even as she set the dog down on a soft blanket, she knew that this was only the beginning. Whoever had done this to him wasn't going to let him go without a fight, and she was determined to make sure that they didn't get the chance. The woman spent the next few days nursing the German Shepherd back to health. She named him Max, a simple name that seemed to fit his quiet, resilient nature. He was still skittish, flinching at every sudden movement, but he was beginning to trust her. Slowly, tentatively, he allowed her to clean his wounds and feed him, his eyes never leaving hers. But even as Max began to heal, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She had installed security cameras around her property, but they had captured nothing, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there waiting. One night, as she sat by the fire with Max curled up at her feet, she decided to do some more research. She pulled out the collar she had found and examined it more closely. The numbers etched into the metal were still faint, but with the help of a magnifying glass, she was able to make them out. 7421. She frowned, her mind racing. What did it mean? Was it a code? A date? She tried entering the numbers into a search engine but found nothing. Frustrated, she set the collar aside and turned her attention back to Max. He was sleeping soundly, his body rising and falling with each breath. But even in sleep he seemed tense, his paws twitching as if he were running from something. She reached down and gently stroked his head, her heart aching for him. What had he been through? And who had done this to him? As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard a sound, a faint tapping at the window. Her head snapped up, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dark, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. She stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on the window. The tapping came again, louder this time. She took a step forward, her breath catching in her throat. And then she saw it, a shadow moving outside, just beyond the glass. Her heart raced as she reached for the phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. But before she could press the call button, the tapping stopped. The shadow disappeared, and the room was silent once more. She stood there, frozen, her mind racing. Had she imagined it, or had someone been there watching them? She glanced down at Max, who was now awake, his body tense, his ears pricked. He let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the window. She knelt down beside him, her hand resting on his back. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're safe." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. Whoever had done this to Max wasn't going to let him go without a fight, and she was determined to make sure that they didn't get the chance. The next morning, she decided to take Max to the vet. He was still weak, but he was strong enough to walk, albeit slowly and with great effort. As they made their way to the car, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced around, her heart pounding. But there was no one there, just the empty street and the distant sound of birdsong. The vet's office was a small, cozy building on the edge of town. The woman explained Max's condition to the vet, who listened with a concerned expression. "He's been through a lot," the vet said, his voice gentle, "but he's a fighter. With time and care, he'll recover." As the vet examined Max, the woman noticed something, a small faded tattoo on the inside of his ear. It was barely visible, but she could make out a series of numbers, 7421. Her heart skipped a beat. The same numbers that were etched into the collar. What did it mean? Was it some kind of identification, or was it something more sinister? The vet noticed her expression and frowned. "Is something wrong?" he asked. She hesitated, then showed him the tattoo. "Do you know what this means?" she asked. The vet examined it closely, his brow furrowed. "It's unusual," he said. "I've seen tattoos like this before, but they're usually used by breeders or shelters to identify animals. But this looks different, almost like a code." The woman's mind raced. A code? For what? She thanked the vet and left, her thoughts swirling. As she drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of uncovering something big, something dangerous. When they arrived home, she decided to do some more digging. She searched online for any information about dogfighting rings or illegal breeding operations in the area, but found nothing. Frustrated, she turned her attention back to Max, who was now lying on the floor, his eyes half closed. She knelt down, beside him, her hand resting on his head. "We're going to figure this out," she whispered. "I promise." But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Over the next few days, the woman and Max began to form a bond. He was still skittish, but he was beginning to trust her. He would follow her around the house, his eyes never leaving hers, and he would curl up at her feet whenever she sat down. She could see the progress he was making, and it filled her with hope. But there were still moments when he would flinch at a sudden movement or cower at a loud noise. She knew that his trauma ran deep, and that it would take time for him to fully heal, but she was determined to help him no matter how long it took. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she decided to try something new. She had read about the benefits of music therapy for traumatized animals, and she thought it might help Max relax. She put on a soft, soothing playlist and sat down beside him, her hand resting on his back. At first, he seemed unsure, his body tense, his ears pricked. But as the music filled the room, she could feel him begin to relax. His breathing slowed and his body sank into the soft blanket. She smiled, her heart swelling with affection. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice soft but firm. "No one's going to hurt you anymore." Max looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude, and for the first time, he leaned into her touch, his body trembling with the effort. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to her. As the days turned into weeks, Max continued to improve. He was still wary of strangers, but he had begun to trust her completely. He would follow her around the house, his tail wagging tentatively, and he would curl up beside her at night, his body pressed against hers. But even as Max began to heal, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She had installed security cameras around her property, but they had captured nothing, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, waiting. One night, as she sat by the fire with Max curled up at her feet, she decided to do some more research. She pulled out The woman knew she couldn't wait any longer. Max's health was improving, but the constant feeling of being watched was eating away at her. She had to get him out of there, somewhere safe where whoever was lurking in the shadows couldn't reach him. She packed a bag with essentials, food, water, a first aid kit, and Max's favorite blanket. She loaded him into her car, his body trembling but his eyes trusting. He seemed to sense the urgency in her movements, his ears twitching at every sound. As she drove away from the house, she kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following her. The road was dark and empty, the trees lining the highway like silent sentinels. Max lay in the back seat, his head resting on the blanket, his breathing steady but shallow. She reached back and gently stroked his head, her fingers brushing against the scarred fur. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. About an hour into the drive, she noticed something, a pair of headlights in the distance far behind her, but steadily gaining. Her heart skipped a beat. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel and pressed the accelerator, the car surging forward. The headlights grew closer, and she could make out the shape of a large truck, its engine roaring as it closed the gap. Max let out a low growl, his body tensing. She glanced back at him, her mind racing. "It's okay, buddy," she said, her voice calm despite the fear coursing through her veins. "We're going to lose them." She took a sharp turn onto a side road, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The truck followed, its headlights glaring in her rearview mirror. She swerved again, this time onto a dirt path that led deeper into the woods. The truck hesitated, its driver clearly unfamiliar with the terrain. She seized the opportunity, driving as fast as she dared, the car bouncing over roots and rocks. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, The headlights disappeared. She pulled over to catch her breath, her hands shaking as she turned to check on Max. He was still lying in the back seat, his eyes wide but calm. She reached back and gently stroked his head. "We're safe now," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure if she believed it. She drove the rest of the way to a friend's cabin in the mountains, a place she knew would be difficult to find. When they arrived, she carried Max inside, his body limp but trusting. She laid him down on a soft bed by the fireplace and covered him with a blanket. He let out a soft sigh, his eyes closing as he drifted off to sleep. As she sat by the fire, watching him sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something terrible, but she also knew that this was only the beginning. Whoever was after Max wasn't going to give up easily. The next few weeks were a blur of quiet moments and small victories. Max began to regain his strength, his body filling out as he ate regular meals and rested in the safety of the cabin. He still flinched at loud noises and kept his distance from strangers, but with the woman, he was different. He would follow her around the cabin, his tail wagging tentatively, and he would curl up beside her at night, his body pressed against hers. She spent hours researching the numbers on his collar and the tattoo in his ear, but found nothing conclusive. The more she dug, the more she realized that Max's past was shrouded in mystery and danger. She began to suspect that he had been part of something much bigger than she had initially thought, something that someone was willing to kill to keep hidden. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Max did something that took her breath away. He placed his head in her lap, his eyes looking up at her with a mixture of trust and gratitude. She gently stroked his ears, her heart swelling with affection. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you ever again." Max let out a soft sigh, his body relaxing completely for the first time since she had found him. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to her. She knew that he still had a long road to recovery, but she was determined to be there for him every step of the way. One night, as the woman lay in bed, she was awakened by a sound, a low, guttural growl coming from Max. She sat up, her heart pounding, and saw him standing by the window, his body tense, his eyes fixed on something outside. She crept over to him, her breath catching in her throat, and peered out into the darkness. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It was too dark to make out any details, but she could see the outline of a man, his face obscured by a hood. He was just standing there watching the cabin, his presence sending a chill down her spine. Max let out a low growl, his body trembling with fear and anger. The woman reached down and gently placed a hand on his back, her mind racing. "It's okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. "We're safe here." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. Whoever was out there wasn't going to give up, and she was determined to make sure that they didn't get the chance. The next morning, she called the police and reported the incident. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but she knew that wasn't enough. She had to take matters into her own hands. She spent the next few days fortifying the cabin, installing security cameras and motion sensors. She also reached out to a local animal rescue organization who agreed to help her find a permanent, safe home for Max. But even as she made these plans, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. As the days turned into weeks, Max continued to improve. He was still wary of strangers, but he had begun to trust her completely. He would follow her around the cabin, his tail wagging tentatively, and he would curl up beside her at night, his body pressed against hers. But even as Max began to heal, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She had installed security cameras around the property, but they had captured nothing, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, waiting. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Max did something that took her breath away. He placed his head in her lap, his eyes looking up at her with a mixture of trust and gratitude. She gently stroked his ears, her heart swelling with affection. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you ever again." But even as she said the words, she knew that the fight wasn't over. Whoever had done this to Max wasn't going to let him go without a fight. And she was determined to make sure that they didn't get the chance. As the fire crackled in the hearth, she made a silent promise to Max and to herself. No matter what it took, she was going to uncover the truth. And she was going to make sure that whoever had hurt him paid for what they had done. But for now they were safe, and that was enough.